The jarring sound of alarms filled the cockpit. A red light blinked furiously on the console, the autopilot screen displaying a glaring system failure warning. In the cabin, the passengers' murmurs of confusion escalated into full-blown panic as the plane jolted violently, sending drinks and belongings tumbling to the floor. Logan Hayes gripped the armrest of his seat, his heart pounding. He wasn't a stranger to chaos. His life had been a whirlwind of media scandals, legal battles over his inheritance, and relentless paparazzi. But this was beyond anything the 14-year-old prodigy had ever faced. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, trying to calm the growing hysteria. "Please, remain seated. We're handling the situation," she said, her voice barely audible over the commotion. From his vantage point near the middle of the cabin, Logan saw the crew members exchanging frantic looks near the cockpit door. Something was clearly wrong. Then, over the intercom, a voice crackled. "This is your captain speaking." The sentence broke off, replaced by static. Seconds later, the plane lurched again, dropping several feet before stabilizing. A collective scream erupted from the passengers. Logan's eyes darted to the front of the plane. The door to the cockpit was slightly ajar. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, ignoring the flight attendant's call to sit back down. He edged closer, weaving through the terrified passengers. The scene inside the cockpit froze him in place. Both pilots were slumped over their controls, unconscious. One of them had a streak of blood on his forehead, likely from the sudden turbulence. The control panel blinked and beeped erratically, and outside the windshield, the horizon tilted dangerously. A flight attendant spotted Logan near the door. "Sir, you need to sit down," she barked, her voice sharp with fear. "They're out cold," Logan shouted, pointing at the pilots. "Someone needs to fly this plane." Her face paled as she peeked into the cockpit. "Oh my God," she whispered. She turned to the intercom, pressing a button. "Is there anyone on board with piloting experience? We need assistance immediately." The question hung in the air, unanswered. A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the whimpering of frightened passengers and the steady beeping of the plane's alarm systems. Logan's mind raced. He wasn't a licensed pilot. He wasn't even old enough to drive. But he had spent years mastering high-end flight simulators, learning the mechanics of aviation as a hobby. Could he actually take control of a real plane? "This is insane," he muttered to himself, but no one else was stepping up. "Hey," Logan yelled at the flight attendant. "I know how to fly. Well, kind of. I've done it on simulators. A lot of them." She stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. "You're a kid. I'm also the only person on this plane who seems to know anything about flying. Do you want to sit here and wait for us to crash, or do you want to give me a shot?" For a moment, she didn't move, her mind clearly battling between the absurdity of Logan's offer and the stark reality of their situation. Finally, she stepped aside. "Fine, but if you screw this up, we're all dead." "No pressure," Logan muttered, stepping into the cockpit. His hands trembled as he took the co-pilot's seat, his eyes scanning the array of controls. The sheer complexity of it made his chest tighten. This wasn't a game. There were no restarts, no tutorials to guide him. He grabbed the radio and pressed the button. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 478. Both pilots are incapacitated. I'm trying to take control." The radio crackled to life. "Flight 478, this is Denver Air Traffic Control. Please identify yourself." Logan hesitated. Logan Hayes. I'm a passenger, a kid, but I know how to work these systems, I think." "Sort of." The controller's voice hardened. "Logan, this isn't a joke. Do you have any real piloting experience? Do simulators count?" He shot back, his voice tight with sarcasm. "Because if not, then no. But right now, I'm the only option you've got." There was a pause. Logan imagined the controllers on the other end scrambling to decide what to do. Then, the voice returned, calmer this time. "All right, Logan, we're going to walk you through this. First, check your altitude and speed. Can you see those readings?" Logan nodded, even though no one could see him. "Yeah, altitude is 35,000 feet. Speed is way too fast." "Good. Keep it steady for now." We'll guide you step by step. You're going to be fine. Fine? Logan thought bitterly. None of this was fine. He could feel the weight of every soul on the plane pressing down on him, each second a reminder of how fragile their situation was. But as his hands gripped the controls, a strange clarity settled over him. "Okay," he said into the radio. "What's next?" Outside, the horizon began to level as Logan adjusted the plane's tilt. Inside, the cabin quieted slightly, the passengers sensing the shift. Logan didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford distractions, not when every move he made could mean the difference between life and death. "Logan, focus on maintaining altitude." The voice from Denver Air Traffic Control crackled through the headset. "Use the yoke gently, don't overcorrect. Keep an eye on the artificial horizon indicator." Logan's hands shook as he adjusted the yoke, feeling the resistance of the real controls for the first time. This wasn't anything like the simulators he'd mastered in his penthouse back in New York. Those were forgiving. This was brutally real. He pulled the yoke slightly, steadying the plane's pitch, and the relentless alarms around him began to subside. "For now, altitude steady at 35,000, Logan reported, trying to keep his voice even. "Speed is stabilizing." He stole a glance at the unconscious pilots. Their breathing was shallow, but at least they were alive. A stark reminder of just how precarious the situation was. "Good work," the controller replied. "Now, Logan, I need you to tell me the fuel level." "Look at the gauges to your left." Logan scanned the panel. Hundreds of switches, dials, and readouts seemed to blur together. His mind raced to remember what those gauges looked like in the simulators. Finally, he found it. 70%, I think. That's plenty for now," the controller assured him. "You're doing great, kid. Just stay calm. We're working to figure out how to get a real pilot on board to assist you." The calm tone in the controller's voice was a thin veil. Logan could hear the underlying urgency. There were no guarantees. He was the one holding the lives of nearly 200 people in his inexperienced hands. "Denver Control," Logan said into the headset, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. "What happened to the pilots?" "They just collapsed." There was a pause on the other end, as if the controller was carefully choosing his words. "We're still investigating, Logan. Right now, the priority is keeping that plane in the air. We'll worry about the cause once you're all safe." Logan frowned. He didn't like vague answers, especially when the stakes were this high. He adjusted the controls again, noticing the plane's slight drift to the right. "I've got a lot of questions," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Behind him, the cabin was eerily quiet. The earlier chaos had been replaced by a stunned silence, the kind that comes when everyone realizes their lives rest in the hands of an unqualified teenager. Logan felt the weight of it, like a physical force pressing against his chest. "Logan!" A new voice came over the intercom, startling him. It was the lead flight attendant, her voice tense but composed. "This is Laura. I've been monitoring things from back here. How's it going up there?" "Let's just say I've had better days," Logan replied, his attempt at humor falling flat. "How's the cabin?" "Stable, for now. The passengers are scared, but they're holding it together. We've got a few medics on board taking care of the pilots, but there's no improvement. They're still unconscious." Logan's grip on the controls tightened. "Great. So, it's still just me up here." "Not for long," Laura said, trying to sound confident. "Denver is working on it." "Yeah, that's what they keep saying," Logan muttered, his frustration slipping through. He knew Laura was trying to keep him calm, but it wasn't helping. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that they were all depending on a kid with no real-world experience. "Logan," the controller broke in again. "We're picking up turbulence ahead. Adjust your heading to 240 and reduce speed slightly." "Copy that," Logan said, gripping the yoke with sweaty hands. He turned the heading knob as instructed, feeling the plane respond sluggishly. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating, a reminder of just how much power he held at that moment. The plane jolted slightly as it hit the first pockets of turbulence. Logan gritted his teeth, keeping his focus on the controls. He could hear gasps and murmurs from the cabin behind him, but he forced himself to tune it out. One thing at a time, he told himself. "Steady, The controller's voice urged. Don't fight the turbulence. Let the plane ride through it. I know, Logan replied sharply, immediately regretting the tone. Sorry, I know. The turbulence worsened, and the plane shuddered violently. Logan's hands moved instinctively, making minute adjustments to keep the wings level. The artificial horizon wobbled, but stayed within safe limits. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he focused entirely on the task. Good job, Logan, the controller said. You're handling this like a pro. Logan let out a shaky breath. Yeah, well, I don't feel like one. The turbulence finally eased, and the plane steadied once more. Logan allowed himself a brief moment of relief before refocusing. He glanced at the fuel gauge again, then at the pilots. Still no signs of movement. The unsettling silence in the cockpit only made his thoughts louder. Denver Control, Logan said after a pause. What happens if I can't do this? If something goes wrong? You're not going to fail, the controller replied firmly. We're with you every step of the way. It wasn't the reassurance Logan was looking for, but it was all he had. He took another deep breath and tightened his grip on the yoke. There was no room for doubt, not now. Logan's eyes darted back and forth between the instruments, each dial and gauge screaming for attention. Denver Air Traffic Control's calm but firm instructions filled his ears, but the weight of the situation kept hammering at the edges of his focus. The lives of 184 people depended on him, an inexperienced teenager with a knack for video games, not aviation. Logan, the next step is critical. The controller's voice interrupted his thoughts. You're approaching a point where we need to start planning for a potential landing. Are you ready to talk about that? Landing? Logan repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Let's focus on not crashing first. The controller didn't laugh. Understood, but you need to understand, this isn't something we can delay much longer. Start by telling me your current airspeed. Logan scanned the gauges. Airspeed is 450 knots, he said hesitantly. That's too fast, isn't it? Yes, you'll need to slow it down eventually, the controller said, his voice calm. For now, stay steady. Let's get your systems under control before we discuss descent. Logan tried to steady his breathing, gripping the yoke with clammy hands. Behind him, the muffled sounds of passengers shifting in their seats made it clear that tension was rising in the cabin as well. He could feel their collective fear pressing against his back. Denver, are we any closer to getting a real pilot up here? Logan asked, his voice tight. We're working on it, the controller said carefully. The nearest qualified personnel are still about 30 minutes away, but you're doing great. Keep holding steady. 30 minutes? Logan repeated in disbelief. This thing could fall out of the sky in 30 seconds if I screw up. You won't screw up, the controller said firmly. You've got this. Logan clenched his jaw, trying to block out his doubts. He shifted in his seat, adjusting the trim slightly as the plane began to dip. His mind raced back to hours spent in front of his high-tech simulator at home, the only place where flying had ever felt like fun. This was nothing like that. This was raw, unforgiving, and terrifying. The intercom crackled, and Laura's voice filled the cabin again. Passengers, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We're doing everything we can to ensure your safety. Logan couldn't help but smirk bitterly. Everything we can? He felt like he was doing all the work. He pushed the thought aside. There was no time for resentment, only focus. Logan. The controller interrupted his thoughts again. We've noticed a slight drift in your heading. Can you correct to 250? Got it, Logan muttered, turning the heading knob. He nudged the yoke gently, feeling the aircraft respond to his touch. The correction was subtle, but it seemed to satisfy the voice in his headset. Perfect, the controller said. Now, let's talk about your altitude. You're still at 35,000 feet. When it's time to land, you'll need to begin a controlled descent. Do you understand how to manage that? Logan swallowed hard. Yeah, in theory. Good. When the time comes, I'll guide you through it step by step. For now, keep your focus on maintaining level flight. The plane jolted suddenly, throwing Logan forward slightly in his seat. His hands flew to the yoke, gripping it tightly as the aircraft shuddered. What was that? Logan asked, panic creeping into his voice. Turbulence, the controller replied calmly. It's normal at this altitude. Don't overcorrect. Just ride it out. Logan nodded, though no one could see him. He eased his grip, letting the plane settle naturally. The shuddering subsided after a few tense moments, and the artificial horizon indicator steadied. "See? You handled it," the controller said. "You're doing better than most adults would in your situation." Logan wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Every decision felt like a gamble, and the stakes couldn't be higher. He glanced at the fuel gauge again, still at 70%. At least that wasn't an immediate concern. "Logan." Laura's voice came from the intercom again, this time more urgent. "One of the passengers, he says he knows something about flying. Not a pilot, but he's offering to help." Logan hesitated. "What's his background?" "He's an air traffic controller," Laura said quickly. "He's not trained to fly, but he knows the systems." "Get him up here," Logan said without hesitation. "I'll take all the help I can get." A moment later, the cockpit door opened, and a man in his mid-30s stepped in, his face pale but determined. He introduced himself as Ryan. "I work for Newark Tower," he said, his voice steady but tense. "I've never been in the cockpit of a commercial jet, but I know these panels." "Great," Logan said, gesturing to the co-pilot's seat. "Then take a look and tell me what I'm doing wrong." Ryan settled into the seat, scanning the controls with a practiced eye. "You're not doing anything wrong so far," he said after a moment, "but you're going to need to start thinking about your approach. Do you know how to set the autopilot for descent?" "I've used it in simulators," Logan said cautiously, "but this system looks a little different." "Okay," Ryan said, "we'll go through it together. Let's start by checking your waypoints." Logan exhaled shakily, grateful for the backup. Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to do this alone. Ryan's fingers moved across the cockpit panel with practiced confidence, flipping switches and scanning readouts. Logan felt a slight weight lift off his shoulders. At least now there was someone who knew more than he did in the cockpit. "Okay, Logan," Ryan began, his voice calm but direct. "Here's the deal. You've got good control so far, but we need to start preparing for the descent. That means we'll program the autopilot for an approach to a safe airport." Denver Control is lining up options. Logan nodded, his eyes flicking between the instruments and the horizon outside the cockpit window. "How much time do we have before?" "I don't know. Something goes wrong?" Ryan gave him a tight smile. "That depends on how long you can keep calm. You're doing great so far, so let's not focus on what might go wrong. Let's stick to the plan." The radio crackled, and the controller's voice came through. "Logan, this is Denver. We've got clearance for you to land at Amarillo International. It's a smaller airport, but the weather is clear, and the runway's long enough for a safe landing." Logan tensed. The word landing felt like a hammer blow. "Okay," he said hesitantly. "How far away is it?" "About 200 miles. At your current speed, you'll reach the approach zone in around 30 minutes, the controller replied. "You'll need to begin your descent in 15 minutes. 15 minutes, Logan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Ryan. "Is that enough time?" Ryan nodded. "It's tight, but it's manageable. We'll program the descent and walk through the landing checklist." "Great," Logan muttered. "No pressure or anything." Ryan leaned forward, pointing at the autopilot panel. "See this knob? That's your altitude selector. We're going to dial it down gradually to 10,000 feet to start. I'll guide you through setting the vertical speed." "Got it," Logan said, gripping the yoke tightly. "Just tell me what to do." As Ryan explained each step, Logan's hands moved over the controls with growing confidence. The autopilot panel beeped as he adjusted the altitude setting. He entered the new values with trembling fingers, forcing himself to focus on Ryan's instructions and block out the chaos bubbling in his mind. "Okay, vertical speed is set to minus 1,500 feet per minute," Ryan said. "When you're ready, engage the autopilot for descent." Logan hesitated. His finger hovered over the button, a swirl of fear and adrenaline coursing through him. One wrong move, and they could spiral out of control. But doing nothing wasn't an option. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, pressing the button. The plane jolted slightly, and Logan felt the shift in pitch as the nose began to dip. The altitude indicator ticked downward steadily. "Descent initiated," Ryan confirmed. Good work, Logan. Now keep monitoring those gauges. We'll manage the throttle next. As they descended, the turbulence returned, shaking the plane more violently than before. Logan clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the yoke instinctively. The cabin erupted in muffled cries and gasps, the passengers clearly feeling the sudden change. Relax your grip, Ryan said quickly. The autopilot is handling the descent. You just need to keep an eye on the systems. I know, Logan snapped, then immediately took a deep breath. Sorry, I'm just on edge. Ryan gave him a reassuring nod. You're doing fine. Everyone's on edge. Just keep your focus. The turbulence eased slightly, but Logan's heart continued to race. The cockpit felt suffocating, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. He glanced over at the unconscious pilots. There still forms a haunting reminder of how precarious their situation was. Denver, Ryan said into the radio. Do we have medical support on standby at Amarillo? These pilots are going to need immediate attention. Affirmative, the controller replied. Emergency crews are already mobilized. Logan, how's your fuel situation? Logan checked the gauge. 65%. Is that enough? Plenty, the controller assured him. Just focus on maintaining your descent profile. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Each adjustment, each beep of the instruments felt like another test of Logan's resolve. The plane's descent was smooth so far, but the hardest part still loomed ahead. Logan, Ryan said, breaking the silence, have you ever done a landing in one of your simulators? Yeah, Logan replied quickly. Dozens of times. But that was on a screen, with no lives on the line. Well, the fundamentals are the same, Ryan said. It's about managing your speed, lining up with the runway, and using the flaps to slow down. You've got the knowledge. You just need to trust it. Easier said than done, Logan muttered. But a small part of him felt reassured by Ryan's calm demeanor. The controller's voice crackled through the radio again. Flight 478, you're approaching the transition altitude. Prepare to reduce speed and extend the flaps. Logan's stomach churned. Transition altitude. Got it. Ryan, what do I? Throttle back gently, Ryan instructed, pointing to the levers. Then deploy the first notch of flaps. That'll help stabilize the descent. Logan's hands moved almost on autopilot, his years of simulator practice kicking in. He eased the throttle back and flipped the switch for the flaps. The plane shuddered slightly but remained steady. Good, Ryan said. You're in control. Logan exhaled shakily. The transition was smooth, but the runway still felt impossibly far away. The descent continued, the horizon slowly tilting as the plane adjusted to its new altitude. Next step, Ryan said. Gear down. Let's get this bird ready to land. Logan swallowed hard and reached for the landing gear lever, knowing the most challenging moments were yet to come. Landing gear deployed, Logan announced as he pushed the lever down. A deep, mechanical hum resonated through the plane, followed by a reassuring thud as the wheels locked into place. The status light turned green on the panel, signaling success. Nice work, Ryan said, his eyes scanning the instruments. You're in good shape for the approach. Just keep it steady. Logan nodded, his focus unyielding. Every nerve in his body was taut, like a live wire, as he monitored the gauges and adjusted the yoke slightly to counteract the turbulence. The descent was stable, but his mind was far from calm. He glanced out the cockpit window, seeing the expanse of land below coming into sharper view. The approaching ground made everything feel more urgent, more real. Denver Control, Flight 478 is on final descent, Ryan said into the radio. Current altitude is 10,000 feet. Speed is reducing to approach level. Copy that, Flight 478, the controller responded. Runway 22 at Amarillo International is clear. Emergency crews are on standby. Logan, how are you holding up? Honestly, Logan said, his voice shaky but determined. I'm terrified, but I'm still here. That's all we need, the controller said. We'll guide you through every step. Ryan leaned closer to the panel, pointing to the navigation display. All right, Logan, see that line on the screen? That's your glide slope. Your job is to keep the plane aligned with it as we approach the runway. Too high, and you'll overshoot. Too low, and, well, you don't want that. Got it, Logan replied, his hands tightening on the yoke. Stay on the line. Easy enough. But it wasn't easy. The plane began to rock slightly, buffeted by a crosswind as they descended further. Logan fought the urge to overcorrect, remembering Ryan's earlier advice to make gentle adjustments. His breathing grew shallow, but he forced himself to stay calm. Flaps to full, Ryan instructed. We need to slow down more as we get closer. Logan reached for the flap controls, his movements careful but deliberate. He felt the change immediately as the plane's nose lifted slightly, reducing their speed further. The engines whined in protest, but the aircraft held steady. You're doing great, Ryan said, his voice steady and encouraging. Just keep it on the glide slope. The controller's voice cut in again. Flight 478, you're 3 miles out. Start reducing your speed to landing velocity. Throttle to idle as you cross the threshold. Logan's stomach flipped at the thought of actually landing the plane. He'd practiced it dozens of times in his simulator, but this wasn't a game. There was no reset button if he made a mistake. Throttle to idle, Logan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached for the levers, easing them back gradually. The engine's roar softened to a low hum as the plane continued its descent. 2 miles, Ryan said. Keep an eye on your speed and altitude. You're almost there. Logan's eyes darted between the instruments and the runway ahead. The long strip of asphalt was now clearly visible, illuminated by a series of guiding lights. It looked impossibly narrow from this angle, and the thought of aligning the massive aircraft with such precision made his palms sweat. The cabin was eerily silent behind him, the passengers holding their collective breath as the moment of truth approached. Logan could feel their fear, their hope, pressing against him like a tangible weight. He couldn't let them down. 500 feet, Ryan said, his voice calm but firm. Throttle to idle now. Logan obeyed, pulling the throttle levers all the way back. The engines quieted to a near-silent hum as the plane glided forward. He adjusted the yoke slightly, feeling the aircraft respond to his touch. 400, 300. Ryan's countdown felt like a ticking time bomb. Flare the nose at 50 feet. Logan nodded, his hands gripping the yoke tightly. The runway rushed toward them, the lights blurring into streaks as the plane's speed reduced further. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, loud and insistent. 50 feet, Ryan said. Flare now. Logan pulled back gently on the yoke, lifting the nose of the plane. The aircraft tilted slightly, the wheels seconds away from making contact. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch, every sound muted except for the rush of wind outside the cockpit. Then came the impact. The main wheels hit the runway with a solid thud, followed by a second as the nose gear touched down. The plane jolted slightly, but it remained steady. Reverse thrust, Ryan shouted. Logan slammed the reverse thrust levers forward, the engines roaring as they worked to slow the aircraft. The plane decelerated rapidly, the runway lights flashing by in a blur. Logan kept his focus on the center line, making minor adjustments to keep the plane aligned. 60 knots, Ryan said, relief evident in his voice. You can ease off the thrust now. Logan pulled the levers back, the plane rolling to a gradual stop near the end of the runway. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the cabin erupted into cheers and applause, the passengers' relief and gratitude pouring out in waves. Logan slumped back in his seat, his hands trembling. He couldn't believe it. He'd actually done it. Logan, Ryan said, clapping him on the shoulder. You just landed a commercial jet. That was incredible. The radio crackled, and the controller's voice came through. Flight 478, congratulations on a safe landing. Emergency crews are approaching to assist. Logan exhaled deeply, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. Thanks, he said softly. But I'm never flying again. The cheers in the cabin gradually faded as passengers began to grasp the gravity of what had just happened. Logan leaned back in the cockpit seat, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. For the first time since stepping into the cockpit, he felt the overwhelming weight of exhaustion. His hands still trembled, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Outside, Emergency vehicles rushed toward the plane, their red and blue lights flashing through the cockpit windows. Fire trucks, ambulances, and airport security surrounded the aircraft, their presence a stark reminder of how close they had come to disaster. "Logan, the hard part's over, but we're not done yet," Ryan said, his tone steady. "We need to shut the engines down and let the crews do their job." Logan nodded, forcing himself upright. "How do I do that?" Ryan pointed at the overhead panel. "See those fuel cutoff switches? Flip them both to off. That will kill the engines." With shaky hands, Logan reached for the switches. His fingers hovered over them for a moment before he flicked them both down. The engine noise gradually faded to silence, leaving the cockpit eerily quiet. "Engines are off," Logan said, his voice barely audible. He slumped back in the seat again, his body drained of energy. "Good job," Ryan said, giving him a reassuring nod. "You've earned a break. Let the professionals take it from here." The cockpit door opened, and Laura stepped in, her face pale but relieved. "Logan, you did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." "I just didn't crash," Logan replied, his words stumbling. "That's not the same as saving people." Laura shook her head. "It's everything. You were incredible. Everyone knows it." Ryan stepped out to brief the emergency responders, leaving Logan and Laura alone in the cockpit. Logan's gaze drifted to the unconscious pilots still strapped in their seats. "What about them?" he asked. "Are they going to be okay?" "The medics are on their way," Laura assured him. "They'll do everything they can." The first responders boarded the plane moments later, their brisk movements and calm professionalism a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Medics rushed to the cockpit, carefully assessing the pilots' conditions. Logan watched as they worked, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. He had done what he could, but it didn't feel like enough. "Logan Hayes?" A deep voice pulled him from his thoughts. A man in an airport security uniform stood in the cockpit doorway, his expression both stern and awestruck. "You're the one who landed this plane?" Logan hesitated, unsure how to respond. I guess so." The man's expression softened. "You're a hero, kid. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Logan didn't feel like a hero. All he could think about were the mistakes he might have made, the passengers who had been terrified for hours, and the pilots who were still unresponsive. But before he could dwell on it further, Laura touched his shoulder gently. "They're waiting for you outside," she said. "The passengers. They want to thank you." Logan shook his head. "I can't face them. I didn't do this for applause. I did what I had to do." "I know," Laura said softly, "but they want to see the person who gave them another chance at life. Just come out for a minute." Reluctantly, Logan stood and followed Laura out of the cockpit. As he stepped into the cabin, a wave of applause and cheers erupted from the passengers. Dozens of faces turned toward him, a mix of gratitude and admiration lighting up the room. A few people even stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. Logan's cheeks flushed, and he looked down, unsure how to handle the attention. I'm glad we're safe," he mumbled. One of the passengers, an older woman near the front of the plane, reached out and touched his arm. "You were brave, son. Don't ever forget that." Logan nodded, his throat tightening. He wasn't sure what to say, so he just whispered, "Thank you." The applause continued as Logan made his way down the aisle, following Laura toward the exit. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a wall, and he took a deep breath, grateful to be on solid ground. The emergency crews swarmed the plane, tending to passengers and inspecting the aircraft for damage. A group of reporters stood behind a barricade near the terminal, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions. Logan winced at the sight. The last thing he wanted was to be the center of another media frenzy. "Do you want to talk to them?" Laura asked gently. Logan shook his head. "No, I just want to go home." Laura nodded, understanding. "Let's get you to a quiet spot. You've been through enough." As they walked toward the terminal, Logan's mind raced with everything that had happened. He had taken control of a plane, navigated through turbulence, and landed safely. Yet, despite the praise and gratitude pouring in from all sides, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. something he wasn't ready for. Inside the terminal, the noise of the outside world faded into a strange stillness. Logan sat in a private lounge surrounded by emergency personnel and airline representatives, a cup of untouched water trembling slightly in his hand. The weight of the past few hours pressed heavily on him, each memory playing on a loop in his mind. The alarms, the panic, the landing. He had barely processed any of it. "Logan, are you okay?" Laura's voice cut through the fog. She sat across from him, her face filled with concern. "I don't know," Logan admitted, his voice hoarse. "It doesn't feel real yet." "It will," she said softly. "But for now, just breathe. You've done more than anyone could have asked of you." Before Logan could respond, the door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped in, his presence immediately commanding attention. He carried an air of authority, and the badge clipped to his lapel identified him as a federal investigator. "Logan Hayes?" the man asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Logan nodded, his shoulders tensing. "Yeah, that's me. I'm Agent Ross with the FAA. I'm here to debrief you about the events on Flight 478, the man said, taking a seat beside him. "I know you've been through a lot, but we need to piece together what happened up there. Can you walk me through it?" Logan hesitated, his mind racing. I'm not sure where to start." "Take your time," Agent Ross said. "We'll go step by step." Logan took a deep breath and began recounting everything, from the moment the pilots collapsed to the chaotic descent and final landing. He described the beeping alarms, the controls that felt impossibly complex, and the guidance from air traffic control. His voice wavered occasionally, but he pushed through, determined to get the details right. Ross listened intently, jotting down notes. "You did an extraordinary thing, Logan," he said when the story was finished. "Most people in your position wouldn't have been able to stay calm, let alone land the plane." "I didn't have a choice," Logan said quietly. "It was either try or, well, you know." Ross nodded. "Still, your actions saved a lot of lives. That's not something to downplay." The door opened again, and Ryan entered, looking slightly disheveled but relieved. "Logan, I just wanted to check on you. How are you holding up?" Logan shrugged. "I'm here, I guess." Ryan smiled faintly and turned to Ross. "What's the status on the investigation? Any word on what happened to the pilots?" Ross's expression darkened slightly. "We're still looking into it. Preliminary reports suggest they were exposed to some kind of airborne toxin. We're running tests to determine the source." Logan's stomach twisted. "Airborne toxin? Like, someone did this on purpose?" "It's too early to say," Ross replied carefully, "but we're treating it as a potential sabotage. The safety of the passengers and crew is always our top priority, and we're taking this very seriously." Logan's mind reeled. The idea that someone might have orchestrated the entire ordeal was almost too much to process. "So, this wasn't just some freak accident?" Ross shook his head. "We don't think so. But again, we're still investigating." The room fell into a heavy silence, the implications sinking in. If someone had sabotaged the flight, then everyone on board had been a target, including Logan. "What happens now?" Logan asked finally. "For now, you're safe," Ross assured him. "We'll be providing security to ensure there's no further risk to you or anyone else involved. But I'd recommend keeping a low profile. This kind of story tends to attract attention." Logan frowned. Attention was the last thing he wanted. His life had already been a circus thanks to his fortune and notoriety. Adding this to the mix felt unbearable. "I don't want to be in the spotlight," Logan said firmly. "I just want to go home." "We'll do our best to keep the media at bay," Ross promised. "But you should be prepared for questions. A story like this, it doesn't stay quiet for long." Laura leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. "Logan, if there's anything you need, anything at all, just let me know. You've been through enough." Logan nodded, grateful for her kindness but unsure how to respond. He felt like a piece of driftwood caught in a storm, tossed from one wave to the next without any control. As the hours passed, the lounge began to empty. The passengers had been escorted to hotels, the emergency crews had packed up, and the terminal grew quiet. Logan sat alone by the window, staring out at the tarmac where the plane he'd landed now sat bathed in floodlights. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from his legal guardian, Claire. Heard what happened. On my way. Proud of you. Hang tight. Logan's chest tightened. Proud? He didn't feel like he deserved pride. He felt like a kid who had stumbled into a nightmare and barely made it out. But as he looked back at the plane, the memory of the passengers cheering him on the runway flashed through his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he had done something right after all. Logan's flight home the next day was nothing like the one that had catapulted him into infamy. This time, he sat in a private jet arranged by his legal guardian, Claire Hamilton, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who managed his trust fund in life with the precision of a military general. Despite the plush leather seats and the silence of the cabin, Logan couldn't shake the unease coursing through him. Claire sat across from him, her laptop open, fingers tapping briskly on the keyboard. She glanced up occasionally, studying him like a puzzle she was trying to solve. Are you going to talk? Or should I guess what's running through your head? She asked finally, breaking the quiet. Logan shrugged, his eyes fixed on the clouds outside. There's not much to say. Claire closed her laptop with a soft click and leaned forward. Logan, you landed a commercial jet. That's not nothing. People are calling you a hero. I didn't do it to be a hero, Logan said, his voice low. I just didn't want to die. Exactly, Claire said. And you didn't let anyone else die, either. That's why it's a big deal. Whether you like it or not, the world is paying attention. Logan sighed. I don't want attention. I want this to go away. Claire studied him for a moment, her expression softening. It's not going to go away. Not completely. But I can help control how it happens. The media is already spinning 100 stories about you. Boy genius, millionaire prodigy, reluctant savior. You can shape what they say, or you can let them decide for you. I don't want to shape anything, Logan muttered. I just want to be left alone. Claire leaned back, crossing her arms. You've got every right to feel that way, but you need to think long-term. This isn't just about one moment. It's about what you do next. Logan didn't respond. He didn't know what came next. The idea of returning to his usual life, private tutors, high-profile charity galas, and constant scrutiny, felt impossible now. He'd changed, and the world around him had changed too. When the jet landed in New York, Logan was greeted by a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Claire had arranged for private security to escort him through the chaos, but it felt suffocating all the same. As he was ushered into a waiting SUV, he caught snippets of the reporters' questions. Logan, how did you stay calm during the crisis? Are you planning to pursue a career in aviation? Who do you think was behind the sabotage? The last question made Logan freeze. Sabotage. Agent Ross's words echoed in his mind, and he felt a fresh wave of anxiety. Someone had done this intentionally. Someone had wanted that plane to crash. The SUV pulled away from the airport, leaving the mob of reporters behind. Claire glanced at him from the passenger seat. We'll address the media when you're ready, she said. But first, I want you to rest. Rest sounded impossible. Logan's mind was spinning, replaying every moment of the flight, every decision he'd made, every life that had been in his hands. He leaned his head against the window, watching the city blur past. When they arrived at Claire's townhouse in Manhattan, Logan felt a small pang of relief. The house was one of the few places he felt safe, a haven away from the chaos of the outside world. But as he stepped inside, he noticed something unusual. A man in a dark suit was waiting in the living room, his expression serious. Who's that? Logan asked, his voice wary. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. That's Agent Ross. He asked to speak with you again. Logan's stomach tightened. Why? Ross stood, extending a hand. Logan, sorry to ambush you like this, but I wanted to give you an update. We've uncovered new information about what happened on Flight 478. Logan shook his hand hesitantly, then sank into an armchair. What kind of information? Ross pulled out a file and opened it, revealing photographs of the cockpit, the unconscious pilots, and the interior of the plane. The toxin that incapacitated the pilots was introduced into the air system manually. We found evidence of tampering with the ventilation controls. Logan's chest tightened. So, someone on the plane did this? Ross nodded. That's our working theory. We believe it was an inside job, but we don't know who was responsible yet." Logan's mind reeled. He thought of the passengers, the flight attendants, the engineers who had serviced the plane. Any one of them could have been involved. Why would someone do that? "That's what we're trying to figure out," Ross said. "It could have been a targeted attack, or it could have been part of a larger plot. Either way, we need to stay vigilant." Logan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Do you think they'll come after me?" Ross's expression hardened. "It's possible. You were the one who took control of the plane and brought it down safely. If someone wanted that flight to end in disaster, they might see you as a threat." Logan's pulse quickened. He had barely begun to process the ordeal, and now he was being told he might still be in danger. "What am I supposed to do?" "Let us handle the investigation," Ross said. "And in the meantime, stay alert. We'll assign security to keep an eye on you, but you'll need to be careful." Logan nodded numbly, his mind spinning. He had thought the worst was over, but now it seemed like the nightmare was far from finished. The weight of Agent Ross's warning settled heavily on Logan as the days passed. The townhouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. Private security patrolled the perimeter, their presence constant but unobtrusive. Logan's world had shrunk to a few rooms and hushed conversations, every shadow and sound a potential threat. Claire tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, setting him up with his tutors and urging him to focus on his studies. But Logan couldn't concentrate. His mind drifted constantly to Flight 478, the faces of the passengers, and the possibility that someone had wanted them all to die. "Logan," Claire said one afternoon, setting a tray of sandwiches and tea on the table beside him. "You've barely eaten today. You need to take care of yourself." "I'm not hungry," Logan replied, staring blankly at the pages of a book he hadn't read a single word of. Claire sighed, sitting down across from him. "I know this is a lot, but hiding in your room and shutting everyone out isn't going to help." Logan looked up at her, frustration flashing in his eyes. "What do you want me to do, Claire? Act like everything's fine?" "It's not. Someone sabotaged that flight, and now Ross is saying they might come after me. How am I supposed to be okay with that?" "I don't expect you to be okay," she said gently, "but I do expect you to keep moving forward. You're strong, Logan. You've proven that. Don't let this fear control you." Her words hung in the air, but Logan couldn't muster a response. Instead, he turned his attention back to the book, pretending to read until she left the room. As soon as she was gone, he closed it with a frustrated snap and stood up, pacing the length of the room. His phone buzzed on the desk. He grabbed it, half expecting another text from Claire reminding him to eat. Instead, it was an unknown number. The message read, "You don't know who you're messing with. Stay quiet if you want to stay alive." Logan's blood ran cold. His hand trembled as he read the message again, then again, hoping it was some kind of cruel prank. But the ominous tone and the timing left little room for doubt. He immediately called Agent Ross. "Logan," Ross answered on the second ring. "What's going on?" "I just got a text," Logan said, his voice shaking. "Someone threatened me. They said to stay quiet if I want to stay alive." Ross's tone shifted instantly, becoming sharp and commanding. "Do not delete the message. Forward it to me right now. I'll have my team trace the number." Logan nodded, even though Ross couldn't see him. "Okay, what do I do in the meantime?" "Stay where you are," Ross instructed. "Don't respond to the text, and don't talk to anyone about it except me or your security detail. I'll send someone to check on you." After hanging up, Logan forwarded the message and then stared at his phone, his heart pounding. The walls of the townhouse suddenly felt closer, the security guards outside less like protectors and more like a fragile barrier between him and whoever was out there. Within the hour, Ross arrived with 2 other agents, their presence calm but purposeful. They took his phone, scanning the message and discussing the situation in low voices. Logan sat on the couch, feeling both exposed and invisible as they worked. "Logan," Ross said after some time, crouching in front of him, "we traced the number, but it's a burner phone. No name, no address. Whoever sent this doesn't want to be found." Logan swallowed hard. "So, what does that mean? They could be anywhere?" Ross nodded grimly. "It means we have to assume they're serious. But we've got leads we're following, and your security detail is doubling up. You're safe here. Safe. The word felt hollow. Logan nodded numbly, not trusting himself to speak. As the agents packed up to leave, Ross lingered. Logan, I need you to understand something. This kind of intimidation is meant to scare you into silence. If you let it work, they win. But if you stay strong, we'll find them. Logan met Ross's gaze, seeing the determination in his eyes. It was reassuring, but it didn't erase the knot of fear tightening in his chest. I'll try, he said quietly. That night, Logan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep eluding him. The text message replayed in his mind, each word a jagged edge digging deeper into his thoughts. His life had already been a circus before the flight, but this was something else entirely, a shadowy enemy he couldn't see, couldn't predict. And yet, as the hours dragged on, a new feeling began to take root. Anger. Whoever had done this, whoever had threatened him, thought they could control him through fear. But Logan had faced death in the cockpit of a failing plane and come out on the other side. He wasn't going to let them win now. He sat up, grabbed his phone, and opened a new message to Ross. I want to help. Tell me what I can do. The next morning, Logan awoke to find a reply from Agent Ross waiting on his phone. The message was short but clear. Meet me at the field office at 10 a.m. We'll talk options. Logan stared at the screen for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over him. Claire had already warned him to stay out of it, to let the professionals handle the investigation. But the text message had changed everything. He couldn't just sit back and wait for another threat. Or worse. By the time Claire joined him for breakfast, Logan had already made up his mind. She raised an eyebrow at the unusual sight of him dressed and alert so early. You're up, she remarked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. That's rare. I'm meeting Ross this morning, Logan said, cutting straight to the point. He's going to loop me in on the investigation. Claire set the coffee pot down with a sharp clink. Excuse me? You're doing what? I can't sit here and do nothing, Logan said, meeting her gaze. Whoever sabotaged that flight, they're still out there. And now they've threatened me. I have a right to know what's going on. Claire sighed, her frustration evident. Logan, you're a kid. This isn't your fight. The FBI is more than capable of handling it without your involvement. Logan pushed his chair back and stood, his resolve firm. I was on that plane, Claire. I landed it. I'm already involved, whether I like it or not. She studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. You're not wrong, she admitted. But I need you to promise me something. Don't do anything reckless. Let Ross take the lead. I will, Logan promised, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew he wouldn't be content to stand on the sidelines. An hour later, Logan arrived at the FBI's field office in Midtown. Ross met him in the lobby, his expression as serious as ever. He led Logan through a maze of hallways to a small conference room where a whiteboard covered in notes and photos dominated the space. This is the working hub for the Flight 478 investigation, Ross explained, gesturing to the board. Everything we know so far is here. Logan scanned the photos pinned to the board. Images of the cockpit, the ventilation system, and the plane's passenger manifest stared back at him. One photo in particular caught his eye. A close-up of the ventilation controls with visible signs of tampering. This is where the toxin was introduced, Ross said, noticing Logan's focus. We're still analyzing the substance, but it was designed to incapacitate quickly without causing permanent damage. Why just the pilots? Logan asked. Why didn't it affect everyone? Ross pointed to a diagram of the air circulation system. The cockpit and cabin have separate ventilation lines. Whoever did this knew exactly how to target the crew without endangering the passengers. At least, not immediately. Logan felt a chill run down his spine. So, this wasn't random. They planned it. Exactly, Ross said. And that brings us to the next question. Why? What was the motive? Logan's eyes drifted to the passenger manifest. Could it have been someone on the plane? Maybe one of the passengers was the target. Ross nodded. It's a possibility we're exploring, but it's also possible the entire flight was meant to send a message. Logan frowned. To who? Ross hesitated before answering. We don't know yet, But there's something else you should see. He pulled out a tablet and brought up a security camera feed from the airport where Flight 478 had departed. The video showed a man in a maintenance uniform working on the plane, his movements quick and deliberate. "This is our prime suspect," Ross said. "He accessed the ventilation system during routine pre-flight checks. We're still trying to identify him." Logan leaned closer, studying the man's face. He looked ordinary, almost forgettable, which made the whole thing even more unsettling. "What happens if you find him?" "We'll bring him in for questioning," Ross said. "But until then, we need to assume there's more to this. Whoever orchestrated this attack might have accomplices." Logan's stomach tightened. The scope of the situation was larger than he'd imagined. "What can I do to help?" Ross gave him a measured look. "You've already done more than enough, Logan. But if you really want to help, stay vigilant. Keep your routine as normal as possible and report anything suspicious immediately." It wasn't the answer Logan wanted, but he nodded. "Okay." As Ross escorted him out of the office, Logan couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving with more questions than answers. The images of the suspect, the tampered ventilation system, and the passenger manifest lingered in his mind, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. Back at the townhouse, Claire was waiting for him in the living room. She set down a stack of papers and looked up, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "How did it go?" Logan hesitated. "They have a suspect, but it's not over. Ross said I should keep my eyes open." Claire frowned. "And did he say anything about keeping you out of danger?" "Yeah," Logan said, sinking into the couch. "But danger doesn't seem to care." She sighed and reached for his hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "We'll get through this. You're not alone." Logan nodded, but as he stared out the window at the bustling city below, he couldn't shake the sense that the worst was still ahead. Logan woke up to the sharp buzz of his phone, the vibration rattling against his nightstand. He grabbed it groggily and squinted at the screen. Another message from an unknown number. His stomach tightened as he opened it. "You were lucky once. Don't count on it again." The room seemed to grow colder as Logan reread the message. He immediately forwarded it to Agent Ross, adding a brief note. "Just got this." "What now?" A reply came back within minutes. "Stay put. Security will double-check the perimeter. We're closing in on the suspect." Logan tossed the phone onto his bed, frustration bubbling under his skin. He was tired of staying put, tired of being a passive participant in a nightmare that kept escalating. The idea of sitting idly by while strangers made decisions about his safety felt unbearable. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, where Claire was already in her home office, talking to someone on the phone. She ended the call as soon as she saw him. "Another message?" she asked, her tone sharp. Logan nodded. "Ross says they're closing in, but it feels like nothing's changing. I'm still the one stuck here, waiting for something to happen." Claire's expression softened. "I know it feels like that, Logan, but they're doing everything they can to keep you safe." "Safe isn't enough," Logan snapped. "I want answers." Claire leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I need to know what's going on," Logan said firmly. "I want to see the passenger manifest again." Claire frowned. "Why?" "Ross already said they're investigating the passengers." "Because I was on that plane," Logan said, his voice rising slightly. "I talked to those people. If someone was acting strange, I might recognize it." Claire hesitated, but eventually she nodded. "Fine. I'll call Ross and let him know you're looking at the manifest. But you do this with his permission, understood?" "Understood," Logan said, already feeling a spark of determination reignite. An hour later, Logan was sitting at the kitchen table with a tablet in front of him. Ross had reluctantly agreed to give him access to the passenger manifest, provided he shared any observations immediately. The document was dense, listing names, occupations, and travel details for everyone on Flight 478. Logan scanned the list slowly, his mind flashing back to the faces and snippets of conversation he remembered from the flight. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but a few stood out. People he had seen arguing with the crew, passengers who had seemed unusually nervous. One name made him pause. James Larkin. He didn't recognize the name, but the occupation listed next to it caught his attention. Biochemical engineer. The man had been seated near the back of the plane, quiet and reserved. Logan remembered seeing him pull out a laptop during the flight, working intently on something. At the time, it hadn't seemed unusual, but now it felt like a potential threat. He jotted the name down and continued scrolling. Another passenger stood out, Erica Barnes, journalist. Logan had overheard her talking to someone about covering a major story, though she hadn't said what it was. The tone of her voice had been casual, but now he wondered if it was a cover for something else. By the time he finished reviewing the manifest, he had a short list of names and details that seemed worth investigating. He sent the list to Ross, along with a message. "These are the passengers who stood out to me. Let me know if any of this lines up with what you found." Ross replied almost immediately, "Good work. One of these names is already on our radar. I'll keep you updated." Logan stared at the screen, his mind racing. He felt a flicker of satisfaction knowing he might have contributed something useful, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of unease. If one of these people was involved, what was their motive? And how far would they go to cover their tracks? That evening, Logan sat in the living room, flipping aimlessly through channels on the TV. Claire had retreated to her office, and the house was unusually quiet. The silence was broken by the sudden chime of the doorbell. Logan froze. The security team hadn't mentioned any visitors. He moved cautiously to the front hallway, peeking through the side window. A delivery driver stood on the steps, holding a package. Logan exhaled in relief and opened the door slightly, keeping the chain latch in place. "Delivery for Claire Hamilton," the driver said, holding out a small box. "She didn't mention expecting anything," Logan said, eyeing the package warily. "I'm just the messenger," the driver replied with a shrug. Logan hesitated, then unlatched the chain and took the box. The driver tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Logan standing in the doorway with a sinking feeling in his gut. The package had no markings other than Claire's name and address. He brought it to the kitchen and set it on the counter, staring at it like it might explode. "Claire," he called out, his voice tight. She appeared moments later, her brow furrowing when she saw the package. "What's this?" "Delivery," Logan said. "But it doesn't look normal." Claire approached cautiously, examining the box. "I didn't order anything. Should we call Ross?" Logan suggested. Claire nodded. "Good idea. Don't touch it until he gets here." Logan stepped back as Claire pulled out her phone. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited for Ross to arrive. When he finally did, he was accompanied by a bomb squad technician carrying a portable scanner. The technician examined the package carefully, his movements precise. After a tense few minutes, he turned to Ross and nodded. "It's safe. No explosives." Ross opened the box, revealing a single piece of paper folded neatly inside. He unfolded it and read aloud. "Stay quiet or everyone you love pays the price." Logan's blood ran cold. Claire paled, her hand tightening on the edge of the counter. Ross looked at Logan, his expression grim. "They're escalating, but this only makes them easier to track. We'll find them, Logan. I promise." For the first time, Logan felt more than fear. He felt anger. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him anymore. They were threatening the people he cared about, and he wasn't going to let them win. The tension in the townhouse was suffocating. Claire paced back and forth in her office, arguing on the phone with Ross, while Logan sat in the living room, staring blankly at the note that had been carefully sealed in an evidence bag. The words, "Stay quiet," or "Everyone you love pays the price," seemed to taunt him, their meaning burning into his mind. The hours after the package's arrival had been a blur of security checks, hushed conversations, and escalating precautions. 2 more agents had been stationed at the house, and Logan wasn't allowed to step outside, even into the backyard. The confines of the house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. Logan's phone buzzed. It was Ross. "Logan, I need you to listen carefully," Ross said, his tone clipped but steady. "We've identified the sender of the package. It was dropped off by someone using a fake delivery service. We traced them to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city." Logan sat up straighter. "So, you know who's behind this?" "Not yet," Ross admitted, "but we're closing in. This warehouse is likely a staging area." If they're bold enough to threaten you directly, they're also making mistakes. We'll raid the location tonight. Tonight? Logan echoed, his pulse quickening. What if they're already gone? We're moving quickly to avoid that, Ross assured him. Your job is to stay put and let us handle this. Logan tightened his grip on the phone. What if you don't find anything? What if they just keep coming? Logan, Ross said firmly, I understand how you feel, but this is what we do. You've already done your part by helping us identify leads. Trust us to do the rest. Logan wanted to argue, to demand answers, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Fine, he muttered. Just don't let them get away. The hours leading up to the raid crawled by. Logan paced the living room, his thoughts racing. His short list of potential suspects, the biochemical engineer, the journalist, and the maintenance worker, played on repeat in his mind. Each name felt like a puzzle piece he couldn't quite fit together. Claire joined him, her expression softer than usual. She set a mug of tea on the table in front of him. You're not alone in this, Logan, she said quietly. I know it feels like you're carrying this weight by yourself, but you're not. Logan nodded, though the words didn't bring him much comfort. Thanks, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The TV was on in the background, tuned to a news channel, but Logan wasn't paying attention until a familiar name caught his ear. James Larkin, a passenger on the now infamous Flight 478, has been brought in for questioning regarding the ongoing investigation into the plane's sabotage. Logan's head snapped toward the screen. There, in grainy footage, was the man he had noticed on the passenger manifest. He sat in the back of a police cruiser, his face obscured, as reporters shouted questions at the officers escorting him. Claire, that's him, Logan said, pointing at the screen. He's one of the names I gave Ross. Claire grabbed the remote, turning up the volume. The news anchor continued. Authorities have not disclosed specific details about Larkin's involvement, but confirm he has connections to several individuals with expertise in chemical engineering. He remains in custody as the investigation unfolds. Logan's stomach churned. If they've got him, why are they still raiding the warehouse? Because this is bigger than one person, Claire said, her voice calm but firm. Ross told you there might be accomplices. They're following every lead. Night fell, and the house grew quieter. Logan sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. His phone buzzed again, this time with a live update from Ross. We're entering the warehouse now. We'll update shortly. Logan's heart raced as he read the message. He could almost picture the agents moving in. SWAT teams in black gear, weapons drawn, moving with precision and purpose. He wanted to be there, to see it unfold, but all he could do was wait. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. Logan refreshed his messages repeatedly, hoping for news. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, another message appeared. Warehouse secured. Evidence recovered. Key players still at large. Details to come. Logan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He called Ross immediately. What did you find? He demanded as soon as the call connected. Blueprints, schematics for ventilation systems, and containers with trace amounts of the same toxin used on the flight, Ross said. It's clear this was a central hub for their operation. But the people behind it weren't there. Logan's shoulders slumped. So, they got away. For now, Ross admitted. But this is progress. We've disrupted their network, and we're piecing together more every hour. Larkin's interrogation could give us what we need to find the others. Logan clenched his fists. It's not enough. It's a step, Ross countered. These kinds of cases take time, Logan. You've helped us get this far. Trust me, we'll get the rest. That night, Logan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The discovery at the warehouse was a victory, but it felt hollow. The people behind the sabotage were still out there, and the threats against him and Claire loomed larger than ever. But amidst the frustration, a new determination burned within him. Whoever these people were, they had made one mistake. They had underestimated him. Logan wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. He would see this through, no matter what it took. The news of the warehouse raid and James Larkin's arrest spread quickly. Logan felt a flicker of hope. It finally seemed like progress was being made. But as the hours turned into days, frustration mounted. The people orchestrating the sabotage were still out there, and each passing moment felt like a missed opportunity. Ross's updates came in bursts, each one adding to the puzzle. Larkin had revealed some details under interrogation, confirming he had been hired by an anonymous figure to ensure the toxin reached the cockpit. But beyond that, his knowledge was limited. He was merely a pawn in a larger, more sinister game. Logan sat in Claire's office, scrolling through the passenger manifest again, searching for connections he might have missed. A thought struck him. Larkin hadn't acted alone. If he had been hired, there had to be someone else with access to the plane systems. "Claire," Logan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Do we have a list of everyone who worked on Flight 478 before it took off? Maintenance crews, baggage handlers, anyone with access to the plane?" Claire looked up from her laptop. "I can ask Ross for it." "Why?" "I don't think this ends with Larkin," Logan said, his eyes narrowing. "There's someone else. There has to be." Claire hesitated but nodded. She picked up her phone and dialed Ross. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned to Logan. "He'll send the list. But Logan, you can't carry this all on your shoulders. Let them do their job." Logan didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something critical, that the answers were just out of reach. The list of ground crew arrived later that evening. Logan pored over it, cross-referencing names with the passengers he remembered. One name leaped out: Eric Haynes. He had worked as a maintenance technician on Flight 478 and, more chillingly, was listed as a passenger on another flight that had suffered a near-identical sabotage attempt 6 months earlier. "Claire," Logan called, his voice urgent. She appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. "What is it?" Logan pointed at the screen. "Eric Haynes. He's on the maintenance crew for Flight 478 and was also on another flight that was sabotaged." "That can't be a coincidence." Claire's face darkened. "Send this to Ross immediately. If you're right, this could be the break they need." Logan forwarded the information, his heart pounding. For the first time, he felt like he was one step ahead of the people chasing him. Hours later, Ross called, his voice crackling with urgency. "Logan, your lead was solid. We've confirmed that Haynes was connected to both incidents. We're preparing to bring him in now." "Where is he?" Logan asked, his voice tight. "Still working at the airport," Ross replied. "But we're moving carefully. We don't know if he's acting alone or if there are others involved." Logan gripped his phone tightly. "What if he runs?" "We're not giving him the chance," Ross assured him. "Stay put. I'll update you once he's in custody." That night, Logan couldn't sleep. The thought of Eric Haynes being caught and potentially revealing the mastermind behind the attacks kept his mind racing. He replayed the events of Flight 478 in his head, wondering if he had ever crossed paths with Haynes without realizing it. Around midnight, his phone buzzed again. It was Ross. "We've got him," Ross said. "Haynes was trying to leave the airport when we detained him. He's being brought in for questioning now." Logan exhaled, relief washing over him. "Do you think he'll talk?" "He doesn't have much of a choice," Ross replied. "If he's smart, he'll cooperate." But as Logan hung up, he couldn't shake the sense that the storm wasn't over. Haynes might be in custody, but the people pulling the strings were still out there. And until they were stopped, Logan knew he wouldn't feel truly safe. The following day, Ross arrived at the townhouse, his expression grave. Logan and Claire were waiting in the living room, their nerves stretched thin. "Haynes has been talking," Ross began, sitting down across from them. He confirmed he was involved in tampering with the ventilation system on Flight 478. "But he wasn't the mastermind." "Who was?" Logan asked, his voice sharp. Ross hesitated. "Haynes claims the orders came from a private contractor, a man named Victor Hale. Hale runs a company that specializes in aviation technology. On the surface, it's legitimate. But we've uncovered evidence linking him to several incidents of sabotage and extortion." Logan frowned. Why would he target Flight 478? Ross leaned forward, his tone grim. "We believe Hale intended to use the crash's leverage to sell a new line of safety systems to major airlines. He creates the danger, then sells the solution." Logan's stomach turned. The sheer callousness of it was staggering. "So what happens now?" "We're planning a raid on Hale's headquarters," Ross said. "It's a high-risk operation. but it's the only way to bring him down. I want to help, Logan said immediately. Ross shook his head. Absolutely not. This is too dangerous. Logan's jaw tightened. I've been in danger since the moment I landed that plane. You said it yourself. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this. Ross studied him for a long moment before sighing. All right, you're not coming to the raid, but you can help us prepare. Hale's operation is built on fear and manipulation. If we expose him publicly, it could destroy his influence. Logan nodded, his mind racing. I'll do whatever it takes. As the raid on Victor Hale's headquarters unfolded, Logan worked with Ross and Claire to release a coordinated statement to the media, revealing the truth behind the attacks. By the time the FBI stormed Hale's office, the world was already watching. Hale was captured without incident, his operation dismantled piece by piece. The evidence recovered was damning, and within hours, he was facing charges that would ensure he never walked free again. For the first time since Flight 478, Logan felt a sense of closure. The people responsible had been caught, and the nightmare was finally over.